Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Charlie, for making all this possible. You may have heard that the cause of our technological problems last week turned out to be squirrels who had chewed the lines at our home on Philadelphia Drive. Thanks to all of you for coming back for the continuation of our study of how the early Christians responded to disease, to the pandemics that swept over the Mediterranean in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. It's very relevant, obviously, to our situation. We are now in the midst of more than one crisis, and the crises intersect and augment one another. As we all know now, we're struggling with the social and racial tension, the vintage where the grapes of wrath have been stored is now being trampled out all over the country. And underneath it all, of course, is the mysterious, deadly coronavirus pandemic, which is still out there. And there may be further waves of it coming in the fall. What we began to discover last week is that the early Christians responded differently to the two pandemics. The pandemic of the 2nd century, which was probably smallpox, and the 3rd century, probably measles, and in previously unexposed populations. These pandemics had incredible mortality rates. Roman historians estimate that in both cases, a quarter of the population of the Roman Empire died. But the mortality rate turned out to be differential between pagans and Christians. As we learned last week from reading the letters of Cyprian of Carthage and Dionysius of Alexandria, the early Christians did not expose their friends and family members. They took care of them. They engaged in ordinary nursing. And the result was a higher level of survival among the early Christians. Now, the rest of our course together, the next 4 weeks, we are going in search of the reason for the differential response. Why did the early Christians respond differently? And last week, I proposed that faith makes a difference. What a person believes underlies their actions. And we're going in search now of that belief system. This week, we're going to begin with the Epistle of James and one of Paul's letters, the so-called second epistle to the Corinthians. Before we turn to those two texts, I want to contextualize, to locate the Christian response in the broader culture of the 1st century, all around the Mediterranean. Because medical science was still very much in its infancy, no one understood the cause of diseases. Readers of Homer's Iliad will recall that when a plague broke out among the Achaean troops, the Greek soldiers that were gathered on the beaches of wind-swept Troy, Homer attributes the plague that broke out to, you remember, the wrath of Apollo, whose sanctuary had been desecrated and who rained arrows, plague down upon the Greek troops. And this provides us with a clue to the close connection between disease and religion in the ancient world, because medical science was still in its infancy when disease struck. Ancient people turned to the gods in the hope of healing. There is no better place to begin our search for understanding than the hundreds of temples of the healing god Asclepius that were scattered all across the Mediterranean. These numerous shrines provide evidence that people turned to the healing god Asclepius looking for a cure. That is to say, the business of ancient religion. And I have concluded the chief business of ancient religion was to deal with the mysterious phenomenon of disease. A simple test of this proposition can be made by looking at a few inscriptions. And some of you may have actually seen these inscriptions. Has anyone in our class visited the temple of Asclepius at Epidaurus in the Peloponnesus? Someday, when the coronavirus pandemic hopefully has passed over us, I would love to lead a trip by the people of Epiphany to visit Greece and Turkey. And one of the first places we would go is the huge temple of Asclepius in Epidaurus. It is in the Peloponnesus, southeast of Corinth. And there are lots of things to be seen there. If you walk around among the ruins today, you'll notice right away that Asclepius is addressed on the stones with the epithets healer and savior. That is what he was expected to provide. But what is remarkable and perhaps surprising is to discover that every god in the ancient world was expected to heal. The Egyptian goddess Isis was devoted to women and to the protection of women in childbirth. Minerva was supposed to restore beauty. There is an inscription to Minerva for the restoring of hair. To Leto, that my wife may bear a healthy child. And to Asclepius for the healing of a tumor. We can see for ourselves how many votive inscriptions were erected in these temples. They date all the way back to the year 400 BC, and they go all the way down to the 5th century AD. So for almost 1,000 years, we have a record, a medical record of the diseases from which people suffered and what they expected the god to do. For example, a man came to the shrine of Asclepius at Epidaurus, suffering from crippled hands. And he says on his votive tablet, seeing the other testimonies in the sanctuary, I partly disbelieved, and somewhat sneered at the inscriptions. But going to sleep, I saw the god in a dream, and when I awoke, I found myself healed. Now, you can see from this inscription that the mechanism that was utilized at the shrine of Asclepius was incubation. So the sufferer slept in the sanctuary at night. Some of the reports suggest that the priests of Asclepius were also physicians. And so medical procedures may have been administered there. Here's another inscription from a man who was, quote, transporting fish to Arcadia. And in a prayer, he promised Asclepius that he would give a tenth, that is a tithe, from the sale of the fish, but he did not fulfill the prayer. And so a fish suddenly bit him. He then returned to the temple, slept in the temple, and was healed and blessed. Here's a third one, a third visitor to Epidaurus, quote, suffering from an unhealed wound. And he was in Troezen, about to be cauterized by physicians. But in his sleep, the god Asclepius stood by him and told him to go to the temple at Epidaurus. He did so, and he was miraculously cured. I should explain that these inscriptions, which survive in their hundreds, are votives. Do you know what that means? The grateful sufferer would erect a testimony to the healing power of the god. The principle, the economic principle that underlies this kind of transaction with the divinity is summarized by the Latin formula, and Jim, you and the other lawyers will be able to help me out with this. Bill Sayre, you'll be able to help. The Latin formula, do ut des, which means I give to you, God, in order that you what? May give back to me. And so these inscriptions that record the transaction between the sufferer and the god might be thought of as a kind of publish or perish expression. The illiterate sufferer who could not craft or could not inscribe a votive offering had other ways of expressing their gratitude to the god. The illiterate worshiper left eloquent testimony to the supplication and the healing in the form of representations of body parts that had been afflicted. Quantities of these survive. Pictures of organs in stone, terracotta, and wood. A list of these has survived from a temple in Athens from the 2nd century, and let me just quote a little piece of that list. On the 3rd row, a diseased leg in relief. 2 breasts hanging from the ceiling. On the right, as you enter, 2 phalluses and a hand. Here is an inscription to Asclepius. The sufferer says, I have set up to you, Savior, 2 statues for my eyes, enjoying my sight again. You have to imagine 2 little stone eyeballs set up on stone dowels. The geographer Strabo and the travel writer Pausanias record seeing hundreds of these representations. They are like what you might see today in the glass cabinets of an old-fashioned medical school. Now, I'd like to stop at this point and make 3 observations about the transaction between the sufferer and the deity at the healing shrines of the Mediterranean. 3 points. Number 1, there is something intensely personal and individual about the quest for healing. You may have noticed that all of the inscriptions are in the first person. So individual sufferers visited the temple all on their own. The communal dimension is lacking. You can see this especially in the so-called sacred orations of Aelius Aristides. He was a wealthy sophist who was a kind of hypochondriac, I guess we would say. He had a variety of diseases. He traveled all around the Mediterranean, spent a fortune looking for a cure. One of my teachers at the University of Chicago described him as a brain-sick noodle. But you can see how personal and individual the quest for a cure was. The second point that I want to make is that you needed resources in order to approach the god. You had to be able to offer the god something, and you needed money to travel. If any of you here have visited Epidaurus, you know that it is not a hospital in the modern sense of the word. It is more like a spa for the elite. The theater at Epidaurus is the most beautiful surviving theater in the ancient world. In fact, it survives so perfectly that performances, plays, rock concerts, and so forth are still held there today. And when we get our travel group together someday in the near future, you can see it for yourself. In other words, you needed resources to participate in the divine human search for healing at the shrines of the ancient world. We can see this clearly in the edict that the Emperor Claudius promulgated in the middle of the 1st century. And here is the context. Claudius stipulated that any slave owner who dumped his sick slaves at the temple gates, if that slave happened to recover, the slave was henceforth free. You see the underlying social and economic presupposition here. People who had resources and could afford to travel to a health spa like the shrine of Asclepius at Epidaurus things were great for them, but slave owners took advantage of the system by dumping sick slaves at the temple gates. Finally, the third point I want to make has to do with the underlying assumption about disease and health. And it goes like this: if you are sick, if you are suffering, it is a sign of the God's disfavor. You've done something to offend the God. And if you are healed, it is a sign of the God's pleasure. Health is a sign of divine favor. Well, let me pause at this point. I think now our little journey around the temple of Asclepius has exposed the assumptions that were at work in the ancient world in the quest for healing. And I think many of those assumptions are still around today, especially here in the United States, where many people have health insurance and many people don't. Those essential workers who have died in greater numbers of the coronavirus pandemic, in many cases did not have health insurance. So you can see the role that resources and access to resources still plays today. And I fear that there are still many people who believe that sickness is a sign of moral depravity, that it's a sign of divine disfavor. Well, let me pause there for a minute and invite comments, questions, discussion. Pastor Charlie, can you unmute the group?
I'm going to do my best here. Let me give this a try. Give me just a minute. I'm going to see what I can do here. I'm going to see if I can do this. Give me just a minute. I'm new to this too, folks. So I'm going to allow participants. Participants can unmute themselves, I believe, is what they can do. So I have muted you. You have to do the act of unmuting yourself. So there you go. Very good. I see some of you figuring this out.
You said that people have to have resources to be able to travel to these temples. Did they also have to actually pay in order to be able to avail themselves of the temple services and the temple priests who were physicians? And Larry, you need to unmute yourself.
Well, let me see if I can do that for him. Let's see. Do you know where that is, Larry? I may have to come in.
Oh.
Lower left corner.
Lower left corner.
Lower left corner on the screen.
I see it. I've got it.
You got it.
Yes. So, Joan, your question is right on target. Now, the amount of money that it took to avail yourself of a real fancy health spa like the Shrine of Asclepius at Epidaurus, and all you have to do is visit there 2,000 years later. Joan, they not only had a theater, they had a racetrack. And they had beautiful stoas where you could walk in the cool of the day. But healing shrines were to be found everywhere around the Mediterranean. The 1st century AD Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who wrote a long natural history. You may remember him because he's the one who witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. Pliny the Elder tells us about visiting a little shrine to a healing God high up in the Apennines, in the mountains. And he found all kinds of primitive testimonials written on wood panels and pieces of papyrus. So the level of wealth, of resources required to complete the search for health depended very much upon the status of the divinity. If you couldn't afford to go to the great shrine at Epidaurus, you could climb up in the mountains and give a little gift to that little god and write your message of gratitude on a piece of wood.
Larry, why do you think it's persisted, the idea that if one is ill, has a particular affliction, that it reflects immorality, disfavor, and then if one recovers, that there's divinity in the recovery?
Right. My own experience of this goes back to the AIDS epidemic in Chicago, and the great number at that time of religious leaders who suggested that those people who were touched by the AIDS epidemic were sinful.
Mm-hmm.
And it took the churches some time to grapple with this. There was a wonderful Lutheran church in the Chicago suburbs where I was invited to teach, where for the first time I experienced the final stages of the death of someone who suffered from AIDS. And what touched me, Jim, so deeply was that rather than condemning this man as a sinner, the congregation, this little Lutheran church in the western suburbs of Chicago, actually had a special worship service for him to celebrate his faith and his contribution to the life of the community. But in those days, that church was a rare exception. And to the degree that this idea that health is a sign of divine favor, it still persists. In a few minutes, when we look at the Epistle of James, I'll tell you about an experience that I had as a young fundamentalist growing up deep in the South, where a little girl, one of my classmates, died because her parents believed that all they needed to do was to pray, that if they lived in the right way, if their lives were right with God, that their daughter would recover without medical attention. So this attitude persists, I think, even in our own day. And I think it has in many cases, an unconscious, ramification for public policy. Why isn't there a greater push to make healthcare available to all? Is it because deep down underneath, we assume that some people just don't deserve it, that they haven't qualified for it, that it's, in other words, that it's something that has to be earned, and it's not a basic human right? So, Jim, your question is very pointed. Are there other comments, questions?
Larry, if I can, your AIDS analogy just struck a chord with me, and I need to share that during the late 1980s, GraceWorks, which was then known as Lutheran Social Services, partnered with the Dayton Area AIDS Foundation to develop low-income housing, specifically for people who were living with AIDS. And we had, even within the Lutheran Church, we had a terrible backlash from our Lutheran congregations. And I spent some time going around visiting congregations to try to explain why we were doing what we were doing. And one of my most poignant memories, I'm sorry to say, was an adult Sunday school class at Epiphany. I wasn't a member of Epiphany then, but I came to Epiphany for one Sunday Sunday school hour, and we had about 40 or 50 people in the class. It was in the old sanctuary that was where the celebration center is now. And it was a hostile class, and I remember being stunned by that. And I remember at one point I urged the class, because it was so large, to be sensitive to the fact that the statistics were so great that this congregation was already being touched by AIDS, and people in the room may not even know it. And it toned them down a little bit. I remember a couple people who later became great friends who just really came at me hard. And then after the class, I see her sitting here. Lori Morris came up to me and said, "Your comment about people being touched by AIDS was right on. There was someone in that class who had a son with AIDS." And so none of us were immune from the lack of sensitivity or the beliefs in the immorality of AIDS back in that time period. I think it's important to remember that.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the honesty with which you've shared that. It is painful, isn't it? But thank you for that. Yes, Larry.
Larry, you need to unmute yourself there. There you go.
Let's try that. There was a young girl, maybe 20, 21 years old, came to Epiphany, began attending services. Eventually, she said to me, I want to be baptized. And I said, "Oh, that's strange. What is your background?" Obviously not one of those denominations that baptize infants. But on the other hand, since she was past 12, the age of accountability, not one of those denominations that baptize later once you could answer for yourself. She said, "Well, here's my story. My younger brother was born, and my mom and dad recognized very early that he was not deformed, but he was certainly very mentally deficient." And she said, our preacher came, was not a Lutheran. Our preacher came and he said to my mother and father, "It's obvious that you have sinned and you have to confess your sin. I'm prepared to hear your confession." And she said, my father said, "I'm out of here." And they never went back to church. And she said, "That's why I never had any religion growing up, and I was never baptized."
Thank you, Larry. That story is very much like the experiences that I had in the churches where I grew up as a young person. Well, I think now we have a feeling for the environment into which early Christianity emerged, and in many ways, it is still with us today. The 3 points again is that too often the sufferer is left to their own personal, individual resources. And if they don't have those resources, they don't usually get a cure. And the underlying assumption is that if you are sick, it is a sign of divine disfavor. Now, with all that in mind, I invite you to turn with me to the first of our 2 texts today. The first one comes from the Epistle of James, chapter 5. And this letter is attributed to the brother of Jesus, not the disciple James, but James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And as scholars recognize, it is one of the principal surviving examples of early Jewish Christianity. So look with me now for a few minutes at James chapter 5. And I want to begin with verse 7. James chapter 5 is a chapter dealing with various situations in life. And look at the advice at the top of the paragraph, chapter 5, verse 7. Be patient. The author says, behold, the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Now, the Greek verb that is translated here, be patient, is the verb makrothumeo. And if we were all together in our classroom here at Epiphany, I would ask you to say that with me, makrothumeo. It literally means to be broad-souled, to be big-hearted, and as a result, to be tranquil, to forbear with situations and with others. And then the author continues, establish your hearts. The verb that is translated establish is the Greek verb steirizo. Say that with me, steirizo. It means to fix firmly in place. And it refers to inner resolve. So there are two, I think, really helpful psychological and spiritual rubrics or principles here at the beginning. Try to be great-hearted. Try to be tranquil. And dig down inside and find the resolve. Find a place where you can establish yourself. Now, turn with me to verses 13 to 15. You'll notice that among the life circumstances that the author addresses, the circumstance that gets the most attention is illness. And now we're not surprised at that. Look at verse 13. I'm going to translate it literally. Quote, someone among you is suffering. Now, notice that the sentence, as I have translated it literally, is not a conditional sentence. In other words, there is no if in the Greek text. The author acknowledges that the situation simply exists. Someone is suffering. Bear with it. Find a place of resolve in dealing with it, because that situation is not accidental. It's not conditional. The Greek word here that is translated suffering is the Greek verb kakopatheo, which is a word with a broad range of meanings. It means simply to do poorly, to feel badly. And it refers not only to physical suffering, but also to emotional, psychological suffering. Suffering that is caused by any hardship, but especially illness. Now look how it continues. Someone among you is suffering. Let her or him pray. Now, this is the first point of difference that I want to notice. It is a departure from the economics of the divine human transaction in the Mediterranean world. The sufferer is not told to make a votive offering. The sufferer is not told to give the god a gift. The sufferer is told instead to pray. Prayer is the response to suffering, whether it is physical or emotional. Now, I think that's important for us to get hold of. The prayer begins with the one who is suffering. In other words, he or she is not a passive victim. Prayer is the form of agency. It's the way in which the sufferer becomes involved. And now look how it continues in verse 14. Someone among you is sick. Now the Greek verb is different. It's astheneo, which denotes a debilitating illness. And it is used of a wide variety of diseases in ancient Greek. It also describes the personal incapacity, a disability, a weakness that is caused by fear of disease. I have to be honest with you and confess that I find myself fearful at this moment, fearful about going back to New York City to teach in the fall. The Bronx neighborhood where Diane and I have our apartment currently has the highest mortality rate in the United States. And the danger for me is that I may be debilitated by the weakness that comes from my own fear. And so the next verse is spoken for me and perhaps for all of you. Someone among you is sick or weak or fearful. Let her or him, watch this, call for the elders of the assembly and let them pray over him or her, anointing him or her with oil in the name of the Lord. Now, the point I want to emphasize is that now the quest for health and healing becomes what? Communal. The lonely individual is not left out there all alone. They are to call for the elders of the community. And in other words, the leaders of the assembly are summoned to join the sufferer who has begun to pray. And they are to anoint the sufferer with oil. Now, it's important for us to understand that in the ancient world, when medical science was still in its infancy, oil was assumed to have a medicinal use. Plato, even the great philosopher Plato, talks repeatedly about the beneficial purposes of oil, especially for aches and pains. Philo, the Hellenistic Jew, says that oil is a good cure for muscle exhaustion. On the basis of this verse in the Epistle of James, the Greek church developed the practice of holy unction. Literally, the Greek word is euchalion, which literally means the oil of prayer. The ritual was performed by 7 elders, later on 7 priests, and it was accompanied by prayer and scripture reading. And in the early church fathers, it was understood that the oil of prayer not only helped the body, but also strengthened the soul of the sick person. And now verse 15. And the prayer of faith will heal the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. Now, notice that the power that heals is now identified as faith, pistis. But it's important for us to understand that the word pistis in first century Greek does not refer to a mental attitude. It is more than belief. It is better translated as trust. So reliance upon the faithfulness of God. And notice that in verse 15, you don't have to be a leader. You don't have to be an elder in order to have an effective faith. The prayer of faith by anyone will heal the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. It is very poignant that in this case, the sick person is denoted by the Greek word kamnon. Can you say that with me? Kamnon. It's important because this word describes a person who is hopelessly sick, who is wasting away, who is weary and fatigued from their illness, and who is even dying. And because of this word, it is my understanding that what verse 15 refers to is not the miraculous recovery of a person who is at death's door, but rather it points toward our faith in the resurrection. When the text says, and the prayer of faith will heal the hopelessly sick, the person who is wasting away and dying. And then it says, and the Lord will raise him or her up. I think that is a reference to the resurrection. Now, I want to pause here and talk with you a little bit about the misuse, I would argue the misinterpretation of this text in the Epistle of James by some modern Christians. In New York City, even before the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, measles was spreading through certain religious communities in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, because some parents believed that they didn't need to do what? Vaccinate their children. Vaccine was not necessary. What was needed was the prayer of faith. That alone would heal the sick. And if you needed more than that, you just didn't have enough faith. This passage has been misunderstood, I would argue, and consequently has been misused. I referred in my response to Larry Hofsis to a very painful and unforgettable experience that I had as an 8-year-old boy. One of my classmates, a little girl in our hometown in northern Mississippi, became very badly ill. And her parents refused to take her to the doctor. They said that if they just had enough faith, if their faith was strong enough, God would heal her. And of course, she died. And as a little boy, I went to her funeral. And I'll never forget, you know, when you have these profound emotional experiences at such an early age, as I sat there in the sanctuary at her funeral service, I found myself praying for God to raise her up at the last day, praying that the Lord would raise her to life. But I think this verse has been misunderstood and misused by modern people. And finally, look at the end of verse 15. And if he or she has committed sins, he or she will be forgiven. Now, notice that the widespread ancient assumption that if a person is sick, it is because they have sinned. That assumption, unfortunately, is here in this verse. It is qualified somewhat by the assurance of forgiveness. Forgiveness will be granted, but the association of illness with sin is found in the Epistle of James. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why Martin Luther raised questions about the inclusion of the Epistle of James in the canon. But this assumption, as we have discovered, is very widespread in the ancient world. And let me reference as only one example. In fact, many of you are probably thinking about it. In the Gospel of John, chapter 9, when Jesus and his disciples are passing through the city of Jerusalem, and they encounter a man who was blind from birth. The disciples ask Jesus, you remember, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or
his parents?
His parents, that he was born blind. So it took Christians quite a long time to turn loose of this widespread ancient idea that sickness was associated with sin, not only with moral sin, but with any sort of rebellion against God. Well, let me pause there for just a moment and once again ask for comments and questions before we turn to our last text for today, 2 Corinthians 12. So, Pastor Charlie, can you unmute everybody?
Anyone who wants to talk can unmute themselves and make a comment. So that is on your plate to be able to do that. Oh, Larry, Larry Hofsis, you just muted yourself. You were unmuted before. There you go.
Okay, how's that?
That's better.
I wanted to ask you, Larry, about the function of oil in this and other passages. When Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, obviously,
yes,
Samaritan stops and the man's been beaten up, and the victim, and he administers vinegar and oil.
That's
And
right.
that, I had a little illustration. My father was not only a farmer, but a horseman. If a horse got tangled up into barbed wire, the way my dad would serve as a physician, he would clean the wound out with hydrogen peroxide. And that's a little bit like the function of vinegar, I think.
Yes.
And then he'd apply a kind of salve, a corona salve. Oh, that's strange, isn't it?
Yes.
That was the name of the company that made this salve. It was for cow's udders and for other purposes, a little bit like a Vaseline. And that was oil. So so there's that one function. But what about the 23rd Psalm, thou anointest my head with oil, and oil served as a kind of function of ordination or designation as in baptism as a child of God. And which do you think is in play here? Or are both of them that when a person is dying, they anoint them with oil?
Yes, Larry, I think both of them are in play here. And thinking about your father's treatment for a wounded horse, so that I could earn enough money to take my wonderful, beautiful redheaded wife on a honeymoon trip, I convinced Diane's uncle to hire me to work at the family sawmill. And I worked there for a long, hot summer. My first day loading wood into the furnace underneath the mill to stoke the fire, a heavy log fell on my leg, on my ankle, and the wonderful old African-American man who worked alongside me, he said, "Oh, Larry, let me anoint your leg with oil." And he ran and got oil and smeared it all over my hurt ankle. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here, and I think it makes all the difference in our contemporary interpretation of this text, is that when we understand that oil had a medicinal use, that it was used for a variety of purposes. Just as you've said, Larry, it was used as to anoint a person for a special role in God's service, but it was also used to cure sickness or to heal wounds or to help sore muscles recover. When we have understood this, then I think this text from the Epistle of James cannot be used to drive a wedge between the prayer of faith and treatment by the doctor.
Yeah.
And that's the way that it has been and still is being used in religious communities where parents refuse to let their children be vaccinated or won't take their children to the doctor when they get sick. And they refer to this text, the prayer of faith will heal the sick. And they fail to notice that the community was involved in a medicinal practice, anointing with oil.
Good point.
Other comments, questions? Well, let me turn then to our last text for today because time is running out. And the last text is really important, in my opinion. It marks a breakthrough in human understanding, in human history. It marks a breakthrough in the understanding of the relationship between the divine and illness. Now take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. Evidently, Paul's critics at Corinth had questioned his legitimacy as a spiritual leader, as an apostle, by referring to the fact that Paul himself suffered from a physical illness, a disability of some kind. Paul refers to it as what? His thorn
Born in
the flesh, right? Scholars have speculated for 2,000 years what this illness might have been. Some people think that it had something to do with Paul's eyesight. Others argue that Paul's thorn in the flesh was epilepsy or some kind of childhood neurasthenia that affected him as an adult. It must have been very painful because the Greek word that Paul uses, the one that we translate thorn, is the word skolops. Can you say that with me? Skolops. And the basic translation, the basic meaning, look it up in the Greek dictionary, is not thorn. Guess what it is? A pointed stake of the kind used for execution. That is to say, for impalement. You see, people were killed in the ancient world not just by nailing them to the cross, they were often impaled on a sharp, pointed stake. And the Greek word for that is skolops. And that's the word that Paul uses here. Paul says a skolops in the flesh, a stake in the flesh was given to abuse me. And the Greek word to abuse me is the word kolaphizein. Can you say that with me? Kolaphizein. It means literally to be beaten up, to be beaten black and blue, to be given the knuckle sandwich. And then Paul says, now watch this. He acknowledges, he admits, he confesses to his critics 3 times, I turned to God in prayer for healing. 3 times I prayed that the stake in my flesh would be removed from me. And now I'm going to translate what God said to Paul literally. Look at verse 9. And God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you as you are. My power is made perfect in asthenia, the Greek word that means not only weakness, but also sickness. Wow. Do you realize what we have looked at here, what we have encountered for the first time in human history? Someone understood that God's grace, God's presence, God's love is with the sick person, even in their sickness. That God's power is made perfect in illness and in weakness. Do you see what has just happened here? The ancient assumption that if you are sick, it means that God is what? Far from you. That assumption, Pastor Charlie, has just been broken. Paul breaks through to a deeper understanding of the relationship between God and sickness. God has not abandoned a person because they are sick. God is with the person. God's grace is sufficient for them as they are. As they are. And in fact, precisely in their sickness, God's power is made perfect. I know that you can feel what a breakthrough this is in human understanding. I can tell you, because I've devoted my life, to reading these ancient Greek and Latin texts, there is no one before Paul who says anything like this. This is a novum in the history of human thought. And it arises from Paul's deep reflection upon the meaning of the crucified Christ, the one who was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. The word of that crucified Christ is a power to salvation. And in this verse, Paul appropriates the meaning of the crucified Christ. Listen to this. He appropriates it as the truth of his own life. The great British New Testament scholar, C.H. Dodd. Larry, I don't know if they give you that to read in Tübingen or in Heidelberg, but do you know what C.H. Dodd says about this? C.H. Dodd has a wonderful essay called The Mind of Paul. And here is what he says about this passage. He says, at this moment, Paul experienced a second conversion, a deeper appropriation of the truth of the message of the crucified Christ. Paul claims that as the truth of his own life. And I think now we are beginning to see why the early Christians didn't put their sick folk out, why they practiced ordinary nursing. Because, like Paul, they understood that God's grace was with the sick even in their illness. Bill, Sarah, I would say that the whole ministry of Grace Works, which I've come to understand through Diane's involvement to be, it may be the most important ministry in the whole Miami Valley. Don't you think, Bill, that the whole work of Grace Works is undergirded by this primal insight of Paul, that God is present, God's grace is with a person even when they are completely sick to the point of dying, even when they've been impaled by illness. Well, that's a great breakthrough, I think. And next week, if you will join me again, and please invite other people, tell them that now we've got our technological problems solved, thanks to Pastor Charlie and the staff. If you will come back next week, guess what we're going to do? We're going to trace the early Christian breakthrough, the understanding of how God is related to sickness. We're going to trace this back to its source. And guess where it starts? It starts with Jesus himself. We can demonstrate that. You'll see next week. And if you want to read ahead, read the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest Christian gospel, overflows with stories of Jesus devoting himself to the healing of the sick. And we're going to pay particular attention to the story in Mark chapter 1 of Jesus healing a leper from whom Jesus does not recoil. And we're going to look also at Jesus healing a woman who suffered from a flow of blood for 12 years, and other stories of healing in the Gospel of Mark. And then the week after that, we're going to look at the psychological dimension of healing. Jesus devoted himself not just to the healing of physical illness, but also to the casting out of spirits that possessed and troubled the mind and the heart of people. Well, thank you all so much. I see my time is completely gone. Why do I always do this? I have a whole collection of watches that were given to me by grateful graduating classes of students. Unfortunately, all those watches are in a drawer, a chest of drawers at home, and I don't use them.
Well, thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Pastor Charlie, and thanks to all my friends. I'm glad to see Kim Berg joining us as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you next week.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.